Lecture 27, Motivation. Having covered the cognitive psychology of knowledge, sensation, perception, learning, memory, thinking, and said something about the affective psychology of emotion, it remains for us to say something about the conative psychology of motivation. Why do people engage in various activities? Eating, drinking, bowling, fly fishing, marathon running, writing poetry, playing the recorder, even when they don't do these things particularly well. Psychologists often explain people's behavior in terms of their motives, but in fact, explaining behavior in terms of the person's motives is something that all of us do. Motives are a critical ingredient in Western concepts of law and justice. People may do bad things, but they haven't committed a crime unless the evil deed is accompanied by an evil intent. A motive can be defined as an internal state that causes the organism to initiate, choose, or persist in behavior that's directed toward or away from some goal. The motivational state of hunger causes us to eat. The motivational state of thirst causes us to drink. The motivational state of fear causes us to avoid something. Approach and avoidance are the essential ingredients in any motive. And we usually think about motivational states in terms of the organism's needs, or wants, or goals, or desires. These are not quite the same thing. We can need something that we don't really want. And in this consumer-driven society, we can want a lot of stuff we don't need. But for the most part, psychologists use these terms more or less interchangeably. Many of the motives that underlie our behavior have a biological basis. And many of these biological motives are based on what the 19th century French physiologist Claude Bernard called homeostatic regulation. That is, the regulation of the organism's internal environment or physiological state. This is accomplished by a set of physiological mechanisms by which the body maintains a constant internal environment despite changes in the external environment. Mechanisms that are so precisely tuned that Walter Cannon, an American physiologist, called them the wisdom of the body. The basis of homeostatic regulation is negative feedback, which means that changes in the environment instigate actions that have the effect of stopping or reversing the changes themselves. A familiar example is a thermostat. When a room gets too cold, the thermostat turns on the heat, and then it turns off the heat when the room is restored to its proper temperature. And when the room gets too hot, the thermostat turns on the air conditioning, and then turns the air conditioning off when the room is cooled down. In positive feedback, a change produces a process that magnifies the change instead of reducing it. A familiar example is feedback at a rock concert, where a microphone picks up sound from a speaker and feeds that sound back into the amplifier and thence to the speaker again, creating screeches and wails. Don't confuse the technical concepts of positive and negative feedback with things like reward and punishment. Negative feedback stops or reverses the change that produced it. Positive feedback magnifies that change. And we've already seen one example of homeostatic regulation by negative feedback, which is the antagonistic relationship between the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. In response to an environmental stressor, the sympathetic nervous system activates the body, preparing it for flight or fight, to tend or befriend. This drains bodily resources like blood sugar, leading the parasympathetic nervous system to kick in to dampen sympathetic activity, slowing down the drain of resources. And after the stressor has disappeared, the parasympathetic nervous system continues to operate, restoring the organism's internal environment to its optimal level. As I say, many of our basic biological motives operate on a principle of homeostasis. A clear example is hunger and the eating behavior that it stimulates. Hunger is based on mechanisms that keep track of body weight and glucose, or blood sugar. For example, the liver tries to keep blood glucose levels roughly constant. If there is too little glucose in the bloodstream, signals from the liver will initiate eating behavior. If there's too much glucose in the bloodstream, the liver will send out signals that terminate eating behavior. At the same time, the liver will convert excess glucose to glycogen and fatty acids for later use. If there's too little glucose in the bloodstream, the liver will convert stored glycogen and fatty acids back to glucose. Under stress, an organism will deplete blood sugar by virtue of sympathetic arousal, and because it's engaged in flight or fight, or tend and befriend, it will not have time to eat. That's when the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in to convert glycogen back into glucose. Besides the kidney, there are also glucoreceptors in the stomach, the duodenum, part of the small intestine, and fatty tissues in the body. And there are also glucoreceptors in the hypothalamus. The activity of glucoreceptors is a very good example of what Sherrington meant by interoception. Afferent impulses run from the liver, the stomach, the duodenum, the fatty tissue, and the hypothalamus to the central nervous system to provide information about the organism's internal environment, blood sugar levels. They are technically sensory impulses. We're not conscious of these sensations, but they're sensory impulses, afferent impulses, nonetheless. In the classic dual center theory of feeding, one portion of the hypothalamus, the lateral hypothalamus, seems to serve as a go center for feeding, initiating eating behavior when glucose or body weight drops below normal levels, while another portion of the hypothalamus, the ventromedial portion, seems to serve as a stop center, terminating eating when body weight climbs too high. Another approach to understanding hunger and feeding focuses on calories and body weight, perhaps body mass, rather than blood sugar. According to a highly popular theory, organisms will consume just enough calories to maintain their body weight around a genetically determined set point. If their weight drops too much, they'll begin eating until their weight returns to its set point. If they gain too much weight, they'll stop eating or eat less until their weight returns to its set point. Now note that by set point we do not mean some medically determined optimum weight, such as a body mass index of 24 or whatever. Everybody has their own set point, determined in large part by genetics and other aspects of family history. Some people have very low set points and are predisposed to be thin. Others have higher set points and are predisposed to be fat. But body weight is not all in the genes. Changes in the environment, like the food supply, can make people thin or fat even though they might have average set points under terms of their normal diets. Moreover, changes in behavior like exercise can also alter set points. But whether we're talking about glucose or calories or body weight, the liver or the hypothalamus, it's all homeostatic regulation by means of negative feedback. There's a similar account that we can give for thirst. The feature of the internal environment that's regulated by drinking is the concentration of salt in intracellular fluids. When cells become dehydrated, or the concentration of salt inside cells gets too high, the organism is stimulated to drink until the proper levels of hydration are restored. According to the double depletion hypothesis, there are actually two different kinds of thirst. One controls intracellular fluids, while a similar one controls extracellular fluids, like in blood plasma. In cases of overhydration, where there's too much water inside or outside cells, the organism will stop drinking for a time. And also of body temperature. For humans, normal body temperature is 98.6. For some individuals, it's a little lower or it's a little higher. When an animal's body temperature gets too high, the parasympathetic nervous system initiates a number of behaviors, including vasodilation, which brings circulating blood nearer the surface of the body where it can be cooled. Also sweating and panting, which also have the effect of lowering body temperature. When body temperature gets too low, the same system initiates vasoconstriction, which keeps circulating blood closer to the body's core. If body temperature is too high, animals will move away from a source of heat. If body temperature is too low, they'll move towards that source, which is why your cat can often be found sleeping on your radiator. Hunger, thirst, and thermoregulation exemplify homeostatic regulation via negative feedback. But there's obviously more to these motives than homeostatic regulation. We don't eat just to restore body sugars, and we don't drink just to restore cell fluids. For example, eating and drinking are also social behaviors. We engage in them as ways of being with other people, and we also do them when other people are doing them. There's also an emotional overlay to eating and drinking. We eat and drink when we're sad, for example. And there's a perceptual cognitive overlay. We can become hungry and thirsty, or at least we can eat and drink, simply by virtue of the presence of food or drink in the environment. Amnesic patients, like patient HM, who cannot remember recent events, will continue eating when served several meals in succession, even though they've already ingested their fill of calories. They forget they've just eaten lunch, and they eat another lunch just because it's lunchtime, and the fact that it was lunchtime and food was being offered made them hungry. And there are other motives that seem not to involve homeostasis at all. For example, aggressive behavior is stimulated by the presence of external threats, and also just by high levels of testosterone in the bloodstream. But the goal of aggression is not to reduce testosterone levels. It's to defend one's territory against competition. Similarly, in non-human animals, mating behavior is tightly regulated by sex hormones, estrogen in females and testosterone in males, and occurs only at certain points in the female estrus cycle. After ovulation occurs, the female rat will be receptive to overtures from males, and will even signal to potential partners that she's willing to mate. But at other points in the cycle, the same female will vehemently reject the same male if he tries to mate with her. As with aggression, mating behavior is under hormonal control to some extent, but the behavior has no effect on hormone levels. They rise and fall naturally as part of the estrus cycle, no matter what the animals do. Well, actually that's not quite true. The female rat's courtship behavior actually triggers the release of testosterone in the male, and copulation will also trigger the release of progesterone in the female. This increases the likelihood that the fertilized egg will be implanted in the uterus. But neither of these effects represent homeostatic regulation, which is the basic point. Not all motives work by homeostasis. And it's important to point out the obvious, which is that human sexual behavior is, to a great extent, freed from hormonal control entirely. That is to say, humans mate regardless of whether the hormonal circumstances are right for reproduction. In fact, humans are probably more likely to mate when they can't reproduce than when they can. Sex among humans is motivated behavior, but it's not necessarily motivated by rising hormone levels. It's also motivated by the feelings of pleasure, affiliation, and intimacy that we get from sex, and even sometimes by power, motives that play little or no role in the sexual behavior of non-human animals. These biological motives, hunger, thirst, thermoregulation, sex, are the basis of what's known as primary reinforcement. You'll remember from our discussion of learning Thorndike's laws of learning, which included the law of effect, that responses that are rewarded are strengthened and responses that are not rewarded are weakened, and also Thorndike's law of readiness, which basically says that organisms learn when they're energized by a motivational state. This motivational state serves as the basis for reward. Hungry rats will push a lever in an operand chamber to get food. Hungry pigeons will peck a key. So these biological motives serve as the basis for primary reinforcement. But other stimuli can take on motivational properties simply by virtue of being associated with a primary reinforcer. A rat who is rewarded with food in a white gold box and never rewarded in a black gold box will head for the white gold box even when there's no food present. Apparently, the white gold box has taken on reinforcing properties by virtue of being associated with a primary reinforcer. This is what's known as a conditioned or a secondary reinforcement. Monkeys will work for grapes. They love grapes. But monkeys will also work for poker chips that they can exchange at a later time for grapes. The grapes are a primary reinforcer. The poker chips are a conditioned secondary reinforcer. Money, in these terms, is a secondary reinforcer. Doesn't do anything for us all by itself, but with money we can buy food and drink and other things that we need. Primary motives are in some sense innate. Secondary motives are acquired through experience. And in this context, emotions can serve as sources of secondary motivation. Hunger, thirst, and sex are innate drives, but love for a particular person or the fear of a phobic object are in some sense learned. We tend to approach the things that we've learned give us pleasure, and we tend to avoid the things that we've learned give us pain. Classical fear conditioning is a good model for an emotional response that's acquired through learning, and escape and avoidance learning are good examples of how this acquired emotion can translate into motivated behavior. Some secondary motives are acquired through learning, but other secondary motives seem to reflect the operation of innate, automatic, physiological patterns. Consider, for example, the peculiar temporal dynamics of affect as noted by Richard Solomon and his associates. The person's initial response to an emotionally arousing event is an increase in positive or negative emotion, happiness or sadness or whatever. But as the event continues, the emotional state doesn't remain at this initially high level. Rather, the level of emotional arousal decreases and then stabilizes at some level. When the arousing event terminates, the emotional state doesn't just go back to zero. Rather, very often the person experiences the sudden onset of the opposite emotional state. Fear is replaced by happiness. Pleasure is replaced by sadness. This opposite hedonic state gradually diminishes and the person returns to baseline, to zero. Again, this doesn't always happen, but it happens often enough to be a source of puzzlement and to require explanation. This interesting pattern in which one affective state replaces another affective state has been explained by the opponent process theory of acquired motivation, a theory that's modeled on the opponent process theory of color vision proposed by Jameson and Hurwitz. The basic idea of the opponent process theory is that each emotional state, let's call it the A state, automatically generates its opposite, call it the B state. The B state is, in these terms, a slave to the A state. And Solomon proposed that the person's emotional experience at any particular moment in time reflects the joint effects of the A and B emotional processes. In the theory, the B state recruits more slowly than the A state. Thus, the person's initial emotional reaction, a pure A state, tapers off as the B state kicks in and counteracts it. This is the phenomenon noted by Hans Selye in his description of the first two phases of the general adaptation syndrome, in which the initial state of gross emotional reaction is followed by decreased emotionality. Solomon also proposed that the B state dissipates more slowly than the A state. Thus, when the original emotional stimulus is removed, The A state terminates quickly, but the B state remains in effect. In this way, the original emotion is replaced by its hedonic opposite. Finally, Solomon proposed that the B state strengthens with repetition. As it strengthens, it can effectively reduce the A state to near zero levels. But this reflects the opposing effects of a correspondingly large B state. The entire pattern of opponent processes can be illustrated with respect to drug addiction, as in addiction to morphine or opium. The user's initial dose of morphine produces a feeling of intense euphoria, the high, which we'll label the A state. As the morphine wears off, the high is replaced by the negative feelings of withdrawal. The person doesn't just go back to zero, and we'll label this the B state. Repeated doses of the drug, however, lead to tolerance. It takes more of a dose to achieve the level of the initial high. This is because the slave B state is strengthened by the repeated elicitation of the A state by the drug. The B state counteracts the A state, so it takes correspondingly larger doses of the drug to overcome the B and achieve the high of the A state. But, paradoxically, every dose of the drug strengthens the B state. This initiates a vicious cycle in which the more you dose with the drug, the less likely you are to feel the euphoric high, and the stronger will be the negative state of withdrawal. Thus occurs the paradox of drug addiction. Addicts really aren't seeking the high of the drug anymore. Rather, what they're really trying to do is to avoid the lows of withdrawal. If this cycle is perpetuated as the addict takes bigger and bigger doses in an attempt to avoid withdrawal, the inevitable result will be a lethal overdose. This is because the physiological effects of narcotics are to depress vital functions like heart rate. So in seeking to achieve a high against the effects of tolerance, the person overdoses to the point of death. This outcome is inevitable if the addictive cycle is allowed to continue. And if you think about it, something resembling the high, withdrawal, tolerance, and addiction can be experienced while eating potato chips and similar salted snacks. The first chip, or more correctly, the first handful of chips, produces a kind of high, but this wears off, resulting in a kind of craving, and then redosing, another handful, and another until the whole bag is finished. Watch people at the next party you're at. Watch yourself at the next party you're at. Physiologically, the addiction to salted snacks shows strong parallels to the addiction to morphine. This salted nut phenomenon is the origin of the old advertising slogan for Lay's potato chips, "Bet you can't eat just one." And something similar happens with chocolate these days. On a different scale, the same kind of effect can be experienced by the so-called jogger's high, and similar effects of extended aerobic exercise, running, swimming, dancing, things like that, on well-trained athletes. Aerobic exercise, extended aerobic exercise, obviously produces prolonged stress on the body, the less so to the degree that the person's trained for the event. But at the finish line, as the exercise ceases, the athlete experiences exhilaration and euphoria. In this case, a negative, state A, is gradually replaced by the positive, state B, of the runner's high. So some motives are derived from basic biological motives through learning, and others seem to be derived from basic biological motives through a physiological process like the opponent process. The infant's attachment to its mother, father, or other caretaker has sometimes been offered as another example of a derived motive. That is, it's been proposed that infants become attached to their mothers and other caretakers because their mothers and other caretakers provide them with food. It turns out, though, that this just isn't true. In a famous series of experiments, Harlow raised infant Rhesus monkeys in isolation from their parents. Each monkey's cage contained two mannequins, one built of wire and the other one wrapped in soft terry cloth. The wire figure also had a nipple that the infant could suck on to get milk, but the terry cloth mannequin didn't have anything like that. Even though the wire mother provided nourishment, the infant spent much more time cuddling with the terry cloth mother who didn't. And when the infants were frightened, as if by a loud noise, they ran to the terry cloth mother and clung to her, not the wire mother. Harlow proposed that what these infants were looking for was contact comfort, a social motive that was independent of basic biological needs for food and drink. The need for contact comfort isn't derived from anything else. It's a basic biological need. Perhaps the most famous argument that human social motives were all derived from basic biological motives was made by Sigmund Freud. Freud's fundamental assertion was that personality is rooted in a conflict between instinctual forces on the one hand and environmental forces on the other. He defined an instinct as a mental representation of somatic excitation, that is, as a wish which expresses an innate bodily need. This instinct drives behavior intended to satisfy the physical motive, and thus to reduce the original need. It's a tension reduction model. It's very closely related to homeostasis. Freud called this endless cycle of excitement and quiescence, of tension and tension reduction, the repetition compulsion. In his early writings on the subject, Freud offered a division between the life maintenance instincts and the sexual instincts. The former consist of biological needs that are necessary for individual self-preservation. The sexual instincts consist of needs, still biological in nature, that are necessary for the preservation of the species as a whole, rather than any particular member of it. For the individual, the sexual instincts are important only in that they give pleasure. Freud paid little or no attention to the life maintenance instincts because he observed that they were rarely the source of conflict and anxiety. However, conflict and anxiety did seem to surround the sexual instincts, and Freud gave a special name, libido, to the energy associated with them. Later in his career, Freud proposed a new classification of the instincts. Eros, derived from the Greek word for love, included the life and sexual instincts. They're concerned with the continuity of life. Thanatos, derived from the Greek word for death, is the death instinct. Freud held that the products of Eros are love and sex, while the products of Thanatos are hate and aggression. Perhaps the most comprehensive listing of human social motives came from Henry Murray, an American psychologist. Murray was influenced by Freud, but his theory moved far beyond Freud's narrow focus on biological instincts, sex, and aggression. But he agreed with Freud about the centrality of motives in human mental life and personality. Murray argued that individual differences in behavior were determined by the interaction of personal needs with environmental press. A person's academic, athletic, or business success might be determined by his or her need for achievement, but this need does not determine success directly. Rather, it interacts with features of the environment, such as the level of family support. With relatively low levels of family support, a person with high levels of achievement motivation might nonetheless fail to succeed in life. By the same token, even slackers with low levels of achievement motivation might succeed by virtue of family characteristics such as wealth or reputation. Murray produced a long list of some 20 human social motives or human needs, but subsequent research in Murray's tradition focused only on 3, what are known as the 3 great social motives of achievement, power, and affiliation. Affiliation subsequently recharacterized as intimacy. Yet another view of human motivation was offered by Abraham Maslow, one of the pioneers in what has come to be called humanistic psychology. In Maslow's theory, human behavior is motivated by a hierarchy of needs, in which some needs have priority. They have to be satisfied before other, higher needs can be satisfied or even expressed. At the lowest level of the hierarchy are obvious biological needs, such as hunger and thirst. After our basic physiological needs have been met, the next need to emerge is for freedom from danger, both physical danger, but also psychological threats to stability and order. Once the need for safety has been addressed, then Maslow believed that people were freed to form attachments of various kinds, to seek friends, to find a spouse, and to affiliate with various social groupings. The next need in the hierarchy is self-esteem, or the need to feel good about ourselves, and for others to hold good images of us in their minds. The highest level of need in Maslow's view is what he called the ongoing actualization of potentials, capacities, and talents as fulfillment of mission, as an unceasing trend towards unity, integration, or synergy within the person. Or, put another way, referring to people in general, what a man can be, he must be. This need we may call self-actualization. Maslow admitted that very few people are lucky enough to be able to devote all their energies to self-actualization, much less to actually attain it, but he did insist that attaining self-actualization was the highest of all human needs. Maslow believed that people like Albert Einstein and Mahatma Gandhi actually achieved self-actualization. But for the rest of us, he provided a kind of checklist of the attributes displayed by self-actualized people. First, realism, the ability to perceive reality accurately and fully, to accept ourselves as we are, and to accept others as they are. Spontaneity, openness, simplicity, naturalness, a well-developed sense of humor. External problem-centered focus, a concern with the world outside rather than with ourselves. Autonomy, an ability to accept and enjoy other people without needing them. A desire for privacy, the desire to set one's own goals and values. Ethical sensitivity, an awareness of the ethical implications of one's actions. And then finally, openness to experience, tendencies towards creativity and productiveness, taking pleasure in experiences just for its own sake, and having quasi-mystical peak experiences. For Maslow, as with Freud, these social needs were biologically based. It's simply part of our human nature that we strive for safety, love, belongingness, self-esteem, and ultimately self-actualization. But these needs are felt, expressed, strived for, and satisfied in an expressly social context. Maslow's hierarchy of needs raises the distinction between two different kinds of motivation. What we've been talking about so far can be characterized mostly as cases of extrinsic motivation. Here, a person or another organism engages in some activity in order to achieve some specific goal or to satisfy some need. We eat in order to satisfy our hunger. We drink in order to satisfy our thirst. We do other things in order to achieve freedom from danger, or to attach ourselves to other people, or to obtain self-esteem. But then there's intrinsic motivation, which refers to a person's desire to engage in some specific activity without any promise or prospect of reward. If you think about the question with which we began this lecture, why do people engage in various activities? Bowling, fly fishing, marathon running, writing poetry, playing the recorder, or whatever. Sometimes we engage in these activities in order to achieve some other end. A professional bowler is trying to make money. An amateur bowler is trying to make friends or score some points on some friends. We write poetry to get published and become famous. But other times we do these things just because we want to, just because they're satisfying in and of themselves. Intrinsic motivation refers to a person's desire to engage in some specific activity without any promise or prospect of reward. The idea of intrinsic motivation didn't occur to most psychologists until relatively recently, the latter half of the 20th century. This is because most psychologists up until then were under the influence of Thorndike's law of effect and its corollary law of readiness, that responses, behaviors were strengthened when they were rewarded, and that the organism's motivational state of hunger or thirst or whatever sets the conditions for what would be rewarding. But you'll also remember that Edward C. Tolman's studies of latent learning showed that reinforcement, reward, wasn't necessary for learning to occur. Still, even Tolman thought that reward controlled behavior, that is, the organism's acting on what it's learned. The implication is that behavior is motivated by rewards and punishments. But it turns out that that's not necessarily the case, even for animals. Consider some research by Harlow, who presented Rhesus monkeys with wooden puzzle blocks and other kinds of puzzles. In one condition, the animals were rewarded with food for making correct moves towards solving the puzzle. In the control condition, there was no reward. In general, Harlow found no differences in performance between the two conditions. And, contrary to Thorndike's law of effect, hunger actually interfered with performance. When the monkeys were not hungry, but received food as a reward, they simply stored it for later access. Harlow concluded that the monkeys were intrinsically motivated to solve the puzzles. They did so even without the promise or prospect of reward. They were motivated to solve the puzzles for their own sake, just for the sheer, whatever, pleasure of solving puzzles. Similarly, in Maslow's theory, the self-actualized person takes pleasure in engaging in activities for their own sake, not because they satisfy physiological needs or safety needs or whatever. And it's no coincidence that Abraham Maslow was a graduate student of Harry Harlow's. Sometimes intrinsic motivation can be undermined by extrinsic motivation. In a classic study by Mark Lepper and his associates, nursery school children were engaged in a task that's normally enjoyable to them, drawing on large sheets of paper with felt-tip magic markers. Before engaging in the task, some children were promised a Good Player Award, basically a big gold star, for doing so. Other children were promised no reward, and still other children received the reward unexpectedly. Because drawing on big sheets of paper with felt-tip pens is something that is intrinsically motivated, all the kids did it. But later, in a free play condition, where there was no mention of reward, and the children had several choices about what they could do, the children who had received the reward for drawing spent less time drawing than those who had not been rewarded. On the basis of these results, Lepper and his colleagues argued that there was a hidden cost to reward, which was that it undermined the children's intrinsic motivation. In their analysis, the children attributed their drawing behavior to the reward rather than to their intrinsic desire to draw, and when the reward was removed, their desire to draw disappeared as well. The Lepper study is often cited as an argument against the use of rewards. But you can see that from this graph that the situation is actually a little bit more complicated than that, because the unexpected reward didn't undermine intrinsic motivation. If anything, the children who received the unexpected Good Player Award spent more of their free time drawing with magic markers, even than the children in the control condition who had received no reward at all. So things are a little bit more complicated than that. In fact, a detailed analysis by Judith Harakevich and her associates suggests there's a lot more to intrinsic motivation than whether performance in some task is rewarded or not. In the first place, we have to pay attention to the structure of the reward. In task-contingent rewards, the person receives a reward simply for engaging in some activity. That's the kind of reward there was in the leper study. But in performance-contingent rewards, people are rewarded for performance that meets a certain standard. Then you have to take into consideration the evaluative contingency. Regardless of whether the reward is task contingent or performance contingent, does the person expect to receive the reward at the outset of performing the task? Or does he or she receive it unexpectedly afterward? Performance contingent rewards, by their very nature, provide feedback to the person about the nature of his performance. If he met the standard, he gets the reward. But of course, somebody like a coach can provide that kind of feedback without using rewards at all. And then finally, there's the delivery of the reward itself. Rewards have symbolic Q value because they represent a certain level of accomplishment, but they're also something tangible, something you can hold in your hand like a trophy, or spend like a dollar amount. And in addition to distinguishing between various reward structures, we also have to distinguish between various types of rewards. Are the rewards controlling in nature, intended mostly to get the person to perform the task at all, or perform at a particular level? Or are the rewards informational in nature, conveying information to the person about how well he or she has done? It turns out it makes a big difference. In a series of experiments, Harlow and her associates examined the effects of various types of rewards on interest in playing pinball among college students. The subjects in these experiments received various kinds of rewards for meeting a reasonable standard of pinball play, exceeding the 50th percentile of all scores. And then they were allowed to spend some free time playing pinball or engaging in some other activity. In one of their studies, Harlow and her colleagues found effects of performance-contingent rewards that mirrored those obtained by Lepper and his colleagues with task-contingent rewards. Compared to controls who received no reward at all, those who expected to receive a reward spent less of their free time playing pinball than those who received an unexpected reward. This is the basic undermining effect. But in two other studies, some subjects received nothing more than evaluation, evaluative feedback about their performance, whereas other subjects received the same evaluation but a reward as well. Subjects in the evaluation-only condition showed less interest in playing pinball afterwards, but subjects who were rewarded as well as evaluated showed even more interest than the controls. The reward, by the way, was a movie pass. So expected performance contingent rewards can indeed undermine intrinsic motivation, but unexpected performance contingent rewards can enhance intrinsic motivation. Based on the results of an extended series of studies like these involving children and young adults being rewarded or not for engaging in various kinds of tasks, have offered a detailed process model of intrinsic motivation and the factors that can support it, those that can enhance it, and those that can undermine it. The model first considers various contextual and personality factors. For example, are rewards being offered for engaging in the activity, and are the rewards task contingent or performance contingent? There are also personality factors to be considered, such as individual differences in level of achievement motivation. Then you have to take into account the reason that the person has for engaging in the task. What's the purpose of engaging in the task? Is it to develop or demonstrate competence? Is it to have fun, to relax, to socialize? What's the purpose? These purpose goals establish the motivational context that influences how a person is going to approach and experience some activity. You also have to take into consideration target goals, which reflect a more specific idea of exactly what people are trying to accomplish when they're performing an activity. For example, scoring more than 20,000 points when playing pinball. Purpose goals reflect why the person is engaging in the activity. Target goals reflect what the individuals are trying to accomplish. Then, because performance contingent rewards are rewards for achieving a certain level of competence, you have to understand how much the individual values competence in that particular domain. How involved does he or she become in the task that's been assigned? Is he just going through the motions, or is there some real enjoyment or other kind of involvement? And finally, there's a difference between how competent the person is viewed objectively and how competent that person perceives him or herself to be. There can be a big difference between these. All of these factors, contextual factors, personality factors, purpose goals, target goals, various motivational processes, will combine and interact to determine the level of a person's intrinsic motivation to engage in any particular activity. Motivation and reward are not particularly important for learning, but motivation and reward do play an obvious role in behavior. But extrinsic motives are not the only determinants of behavior. There are also intrinsic motives, and extrinsic motives do not always undermine intrinsic motives. Whether reward undermines intrinsic motivation depends on what the reward is for, how the reward is perceived, and, frankly, whether the person cares. But in any case, the two kinds of motives, extrinsic motives and intrinsic motives, together determine whether a person is going to engage in some particular activity.